The lighthouse at Cape Farewell was the loneliest posting in the British Empire. Perched on a slab of granite at the southern tip of Greenland, it marked the boundary between the North Atlantic and the Arctic, where icebergs the size of cathedrals drifted south in stately procession. The nearest settlement was a Danish trading post 60 miles up the coast, reachable only by boat when the sea was calm, which was almost never. 3 keepers manned the light in rotation, 2 months on, 1 month off. In the winter of 1912, the keepers were Thomas Blackwood, a retired naval officer with a damaged leg. His assistant, Finn Halvorsen, a Norwegian immigrant who had been keeping lights for 30 years. And the new man, James Corrigan, 23 years old, fresh from the mainland, who had taken the posting because he was running from a broken engagement and wanted to be as far from other people as geographically possible. Life at Cape Farewell followed a rhythm as precise as the clockwork that turned the light. Every 4 hours, the keeper on watch climbed the 97 steps to the lamp room and wound the mechanism that rotated the Fresnel lens. Every morning, the glass was cleaned, the wicks were trimmed, and the oil reservoirs were checked. Every evening, the light was lit at precisely the moment the sun touched the horizon. Between watches, the keepers maintained the building, cooked meals, read books, and tried not to drive each other mad in the confined space. Blackwood kept to himself, reading naval histories and writing letters to a sister in Bristol that he would not be able to post until the supply ship came in April. Halvorsen was pleasant company, full of stories from his decades of lighthouse keeping, a man who had made peace with solitude long ago. Corrigan found the routine both suffocating and strangely comforting. There was no room for regret when every hour had a task. Corrigan had been at the lighthouse for 3 weeks when the first real storm hit. He had experienced bad weather on the crossing from Reykjavik, but nothing prepared him for an Arctic gale striking an exposed headland. The wind came from the north, carrying ice crystals that scoured the granite and frosted the windows opaque within hours. The sea rose 30 feet up the cliff face, sending spray over the top that froze on contact with the lighthouse walls. The building shook with every wave impact. Inside the lamp room, Corrigan clung to the railing and watched the Fresnel lens rotate through ice that kept forming on its surface despite the heat of the lamps. He scraped the ice away every 15 minutes, knowing that if the beam was obscured, any ship caught in the storm would have no warning of the rocks below. Storm lasted 4 days. When it cleared, the sea was full of ice. Not the towering icebergs that normally pass the cape, but a field of broken pack ice that stretched to the horizon, a white plain interrupted by pressure ridges and dark leads of open water. And in the middle of the ice field, perhaps 2 miles offshore, was a ship. Corrigan saw it first during his dawn watch, a dark shape against the white that resolved through the telescope into a 3-masted bark, wooden-hulled, trapped and listing to port. No smoke rose from her funnel. No flags flew from her masts. She appeared abandoned, but Corrigan knew that appearances meant nothing in the Arctic. Ships could look dead and still have living crews trapped below decks, conserving heat, rationing supplies, waiting for rescue that might never come. Blackwood studied the ship through his own telescope for a long time before speaking. He was not a man who rushed to judgment. His damaged leg, shattered by a falling yard during a Pacific typhoon 20 years earlier, had taught him the cost of hasty action. But his years in the Navy had also taught him the cost of inaction when lives were at stake. "We cannot reach her by boat," he said, stating the obvious. The pack ice was too dense and too unstable for their small tender. "But if the ice holds, a man might walk." Halvorsen, who knew Arctic ice better than either of them, studied the field with experienced eyes. "It will hold for a day, maybe 2, then the current will break it up." Blackwood nodded. "Then we go today. Halvorsen, you have the light. Corrigan, you are coming with me." It was not a question. Corrigan felt a knot of fear in his stomach, but he also felt something else. Purpose. For the first time since leaving England, he had a reason to move forward instead of running away. They set out at first light, carrying coils of rope, a medical kit, water, hardtack biscuits, and a compass. Blackwood moved slowly on his bad leg, using a staff cut from the lighthouse's spare timber. Corrigan walked ahead, testing the ice with each step, listening for the groans and cracks that warned of instability. The ice field was a landscape of its own. Flat pans of gray-white ice separated by pressure ridges where the floes had collided and piled up in jagged walls. In places, the ice was clear enough to see the dark water beneath, and Corrigan tried not to look down. The ship grew larger as they approached. She was a bark of perhaps 800 tons, her hull staved in on the port side where the ice had crushed her planking. Her masts were intact, but her rigging hung in frozen tangles. Ice coated her deck and superstructure, giving her the appearance of a ghost ship, a vessel made of frost and silence. Her name, barely visible beneath the ice, was the Esperanza. Portuguese. They found them below decks, in the ship's galley where the cast-iron stove still held a remnant of warmth. 11 men, Portuguese and Cape Verdean sailors, huddled together under every blanket and piece of canvas on the ship. 3 were unconscious. 2 had frostbitten hands and feet. The captain, a broad-shouldered man named Silva, was the only one still standing when Blackwood and Corrigan climbed down the companionway. He had kept his crew alive for 6 days since the ice had trapped the Esperanza, rationing the remaining coal and food with the discipline of a man who understood exactly how close they were to death. He spoke no English. Corrigan spoke no Portuguese. But when Silva saw the lighthouse keeper's uniform and the rope coiled over Corrigan's shoulder, his face broke into an expression that needed no translation. He seized Corrigan's hand and held it, and Corrigan felt the man's grip trembling with exhaustion and relief. It was the first time anyone had touched him with gratitude since he had left England, and it shook something loose inside him that he had been trying very hard to keep locked away. Getting 11 men across 2 miles of unstable ice was the hardest thing any of them had ever done. They roped the survivors together in a chain, with Corrigan at the front testing the ice and Blackwood at the rear, his bad legs screaming with every step but his naval training keeping him upright and moving. The 3 unconscious men were dragged on improvised sledges made from cabin doors. The crossing took 9 hours. Twice the ice cracked beneath them, and they had to detour around widening leads of black water. Once a pressure ridge collapsed as they were climbing over it, and 2 of the Portuguese sailors nearly went into the sea before Corrigan hauled them back by their ropes. By the time they reached the lighthouse, it was dark. Havorson had the door open and hot soup on the stove, and every blanket in the building laid out on the floor. The lighthouse, built for 3 men, somehow absorbed 11 more. They packed in shoulder to shoulder, sharing body heat, sharing food, sharing the simple miracle of being alive and warm and out of the ice. The supply ship would not come until April. It was January. For 3 months, 14 men lived in a lighthouse built for 3, surviving on stretched rations and fish that Havorson caught through holes chopped in the ice. Language barriers dissolved slowly through necessity and patience. Corrigan learned enough Portuguese to have simple conversations. Silva learned enough English to tell stories about his voyages, about the ports of Lisbon and Luanda and Macau, about a life spent moving across the surface of the world. In the long, dark evenings, when the wind howled outside and the lamp burned steady above, Corrigan found himself telling Silva about England, about the woman he had been engaged to, about the letter she had sent, ending it, about the shame and the grief that had driven him to the most remote posting he could find. Silva listened with the patience of a man who had weathered worse storms than heartbreak, and when Corrigan was finished, he said in his careful English, "You did not run away. You sailed to where you were needed. There is no shame in that." The ice broke up in late March, earlier than expected. The supply ship arrived on the 2nd of April, and with it came the outside world, newspapers, letters, a replacement keeper for Corrigan's rotation. The Portuguese sailors were transferred to a Danish vessel that would carry them to Copenhagen and eventually home. Corrigan stood on the dock and shook each man's hand. When he reached Silva, the captain embraced him, pressed something into his palm, and spoke a phrase in Portuguese that Corrigan had learned enough to understand. "Fair winds." Corrigan opened his hand. It was a compass, old and battered, its case engraved with the name Esperanza. He carried it for the rest of his life. He stayed at Cape Farewell for another 2 years, completing his posting. Then he returned to England, not running from anything this time, but walking towards something. He never married the woman who had broken their engagement. He married someone else years later, a lighthouse keeper's daughter from the Scottish coast who understood without being told that some men need to be near the sea. He named his first son Thomas, after Blackwood, and his second son Finn, after Havorson. He never named anyone Silva. Some debts were too large for a name. He kept the compass on his desk until the day he died, and his grandchildren, who inherited it, never knew the story behind it. But the compass still pointed north, steady and true, a small artifact from the winter when 14 men survived the ice together, and a young man who had come to the edge of the world found a reason to come back.